So we are ready to look at what we're going to see here in chapter 20 are the 10 Commandments. Get this to work. There we go. All right. So in the first 17 verses, chapter 20, we see this is where God delivers the 10 Commandments to Moses. And you'll notice, I think, your first question on your homework for this week, what is the Decalogue? What is the Decalogue? It's the 10 Commandments. Yeah, that's it. So that's a real simple answer on that one. That's the name for the 10 Commandments, the Decalogue. What it's known collectively. We typically just say the 10 Commandments, but the official name, if you will, is the Decalogue. Okay? And so we do want to note that, of course, there is a distinction within the commandments. So when you look at the first 4 commandments, the first 4 deal with man's obligation to God. All right? I think that's one of your questions too. So the first 4 commandments deal with man's obligation to God. And then the last 6 commandments, what do they deal with? Yeah, man's obligation to his fellow man. Right. So the first 4, man's obligations to God. The last 6, man's obligations to each other. Okay, and we noticed this before. We talked about it in Mark 12, verses 29 through 31. One of the places where Jesus really summarized when he's asked, what's the greatest commandment? And Jesus is really kind of in a sense summarizing the 10 commandments when he basically breaks it down to 2 things. Love God, love each other. Okay? If you do those 2 things, if you love God and you love each other, what will you be doing? You will be fulfilling all of God's commands. You'll obey everything. Okay? So that doesn't mean we get to say, well, I'm going to treat somebody out of love so I can ignore a command of God because I'm showing them my love. That's not what Jesus meant. Okay? Because some people, they try to, he said that's all you got to do so we can ignore all this other stuff. No, that's not what Jesus was saying. He was saying that sums it up. If you love God and you love your fellow man, then you're going to obey everything that God told you to do. You're not going to try to skim out on something. You're going to do everything. So it's one way of summarizing what the commandments talk about. And in general, the law of God, that's what it's about. Okay? Now, we know that the stone tablets, we know that the commandments were written on both sides. So, and I don't remember if they had that in the movie or not, if Charlton Heston had it on both sides or not, but the Bible tells us in Exodus 32, verses 15 and 16, that God wrote them on both sides of the 2 tablets. Exodus 31:18 tells us that God wrote them with his finger. So a lot of times people think God dictated it and Moses, carved them in. No, God did it with his finger. And we do know, of course, at some point that we'll notice a little bit later in our study, what's going to happen to those original tablets? Well, the 10 Commandments will be, but I'm talking about the original stone tablets. Yeah, Moses is going to break those when he comes down and they've got the golden calf, right? And God tells Moses that he will rewrite them. Okay, so the original ones were broken by Moses, but in Exodus 34, God informs Moses he'll write them again. And there is no indication there that God is angry with Moses for breaking them. Like, how dare you break my Moses? A lot of people will say, well, if you're a Christian, you're not allowed to get mad. You can't ever have anger. Was that true? No. So why didn't Moses get in trouble for doing that? Do what? That's what I'm saying. Why didn't he? Why didn't God say, how dare you break my tablets? Moses was angry, but it was righteous anger, right? Because he comes down and of all people, Aaron, what are you doing, Aaron? I left you in charge, and what is going on here, right? So he had righteous anger. What about Jesus? He ever get mad when you overthrow the money changers' tables, right? Jesus was without sin. But you'll have people, well, Christians can't be angry. That's not true. But it's got to be righteous anger, right? It can't be the wrong kind of anger. Well, Moses is so angry because of what he sees when he comes down. He's going to break those tablets. And again, there's no indication anywhere in the scriptures that God was displeased about that. He simply tells Moses, like, don't worry about it. I'll write them again. Okay, so he'll get the tablets again, but these originals, that's what they happen to, or that's what happened to him. So we want to notice, of course, that Jesus took away the old law, the law that we're studying here, getting ready to study. He took away the old law because what did he do? The Pharisees accused him of violating the law. He said, I didn't violate the law. What is he doing? Yeah, I came to fulfill the law, right? So he is going to end it because it had served its purpose. It was fulfilled. So Matthew 5:17, Jesus said, think not that I come to destroy the law or the prophets. I'm not come to destroy, but to fulfill. Because the Pharisees were accused, you're not obeying the law. You came to kill it. No, he came to fulfill it. And then we see in Colossians 2:14, blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, talking about the old law, which was contrary to us, and took it out of the way. How did he do that? Nailing it to his cross. Okay, that's what happened to the Old Testament. That's what happened to the old law. Okay, but we do want to notice before we say, well, doesn't that mean the Ten Commandments are irrelevant? Not at all. Okay, because what we're going to see as you go through the New Testament, that 9 of these 10 commandments are restated in some form, and you have that one of the handouts that I gave you. 9 of the 10 are still in some shape, form, or fashion part of the gospel of Christ. Okay? Which one is missing? Keep the Sabbath holy, 4th commandment, right? That's the only one that's missing. Okay, so we do want to note that. So, and again, that's that chart that I gave you. You'll see the scriptural references there for where you can find New Testament references to 9 of these 10 commandments, but you don't see the command to keep the Sabbath anywhere in the New Testament. Okay? Now, we want to note as well that a lot of people have trouble seemingly understanding this, because not just about this, but about all of God's law. You notice they're called the 10 Commandments. They're not called the 10 Suggestions. Right? God's not saying, well, here's a few thoughts I had, but you don't really have to go by it if you don't want to. Just thought I'd throw it out there because I was bored and I didn't have anything better to do. Now, these are commandments. They're not suggestions. Okay? Neither Moses nor Aaron nor any of the Israelites got a vote on this. Okay? Who's for the first commandment? Who wants that? Oh, you guys don't like that one? You know, they didn't get to vote on it. God decreed it. Look, this is the way it's going to be. It's not open for debate or discussion. You don't get to vote on it. You don't get to make amendments, alternatives. Now, is that true in the New Testament for the gospel of Christ? Just as true, right? We don't get to change it because we feel like it. Well, I don't like that one. I'd rather do something else. Well, it's not up to us. What God has commanded, that's it. Okay? And so everybody needs to understand that, and so many people think, well, they can make alterations or do whatever they want. So let's look at each one of these. First of all, the first commandment in verse 3. This prohibits all forms of idolatry. Okay? Now, why is that?
You don't want to have any other God.
Right. There's only one true God. That's it. Okay? We've talked about all the false Egyptian gods. You saw what good they did. Right? There is only one God. So this would include a prohibition against the polytheistic religions of Egypt, which they would have been familiar with, the polytheistic religion of the Greeks, of course the Romans when they come along, anything like that, it prohibits all those things. There is only one God. Okay? So a lot of times we think of idolatry just in that form. Say, well, I don't practice idolatry because I don't have a Buddha statue in my living room. And that's one form of it, right? But can idolatry include other things besides a wooden or a gold statue in my house? Okay? You got all kinds of things that can be idolatrous. You could talk about, like we were just talking about a while ago, people's hobbies, right? Told Sid, get your priorities straight. Well, Sid had his priorities straight. He wanted to put God first. That guy wanted to put that class first, right? So people's hobbies get in the way. Well, we didn't see you at church on Sunday. Well, we were out on the lake. It was such a beautiful day. We just enjoyed the Lord out there. I was on the golf course. Those can become our idols if it takes the place of God. Our career can become an idol. Well, I work all the time. I don't have time to go to church. Right? Money can become our idol. That's what our obsession is, and that's everything that we're dedicated to. Anything that takes the place of God as first in our life, if anything supplants God, well, that's an idol. So it doesn't have to be this statue. A lot of people in our society today, it's famous people, right? Singers or athletes or movie stars. One in particular right now. Jacob is so aggravated. Got home from church, watching the Super Bowl, and he can't watch the game for seeing Taylor Swift every 10 seconds. Oh, he was fired up. I just want to watch the foot. I don't care about Taylor Swift. But everybody is so obsessed. And Sunday, after I got our preacher to shut up eventually, which is a hard job, he goes and he goes. So, but I went to lunch at Michael's up there, and there's a lady sitting in the booth next to me, breathlessly telling somebody about how Taylor just got through with a concert in Tokyo and she's on a plane and she's trying to get here for the Super Bowl, and said, I haven't checked in the last few minutes. I have no idea where she is. I mean, this woman was frantic. Like, for Taylor Swift? And you just want to say, were you that excited about worshiping God this morning, or did you even go worship God? I doubt it. So anything like that can become an idol. And so this prohibits that. And of course, as you can see in your chart, carries over into the New Testament. God has to be the top priority in our life. And if I put anything in His place, that has become my idol, and that is forbidden. So let's look at the second commandment, which is related to the first one, because usually idolatry leads to this. We cannot make any graven images for religious purposes. Create something, an object to worship. Like we're going to see, of course, eventually, Aaron's going to violate that one big time, and they all are, right, with the golden calf. But we cannot make any graven image for religious purposes. We don't know what God looks like. Nobody's ever seen the face of God. We don't know what God looks like. I mean, Jesus took human form, but that's not His true form. Jesus is a spirit, right? So He took the form of a man, but that's not really. And even Jesus, do we know what He looked like, His human form? He wasn't pretty. He's average Joe, right? We got all these Renaissance artists that painted, he looks like Barry Gibb from the Bee Gees. That's what Jesus looks like. That's what it always reminded me of. Anytime I see those poor, I say, that looks like Barry Gibb, But we have no idea what Jesus looked like. Even in human form, we don't know what he looked like. So it's just somebody's imagination, but we certainly don't know what God looks like. So we have no business trying to make an idol, an image of God, when we don't have a model to go by. And typically when they make these images, it's not for the true God anyway. It's for something else. And so again, this goes along with idolatry. They make a graven image of their idol. And God makes it clear that he is a jealous God in the sense that he's not going to tolerate any rival to his throne, to his position. And that is for our own good. We don't need to be following false idols, false graven images. Because following these false gods often leads people to sin. You get into the first century, you look at what the Romans did. Unbelievable levels of debauchery, right? And a lot of that surrounded these false gods that they'd come up with, like, these gods, they want us to do all these immoral things. That's what this often leads to. Of course, God knows that. So this has a tendency to corrupt people. And God is trying to get them, he's trying to prevent that. Just worship the one true God. Now, does God have a right to be so picky? I mean, does he have a right to expect us to be loyal to him and him only? I mean, just because he created us and made the universe, I mean, it's kind of selfish, isn't it? He has every right to do that. And we should, to me, that's not that hard to understand, but apparently for some people it is. And God is not going to accept us dividing our loyalty, dividing our attention, or any kind of half-hearted effort. We got to be all in and completely devoted to him. Now, if you think about in the book of Revelation, the letters to the 7 churches in Asia, and one of those was the Laodiceans, the church at Laodicea. And Jesus wrote to them, and does anybody remember what he chastised them for and what he was going to do about it? Do what? Yeah, they were lukewarm. You're not hot or cold. You're just kind of, yeah, I'm sort of on your side. And what did he say he would do? I will spew you out of my mouth because you're not dedicated. You're not committed. You're sort of kind of religious. You're sort of kind of following God. Well, that doesn't cut it. And just like us, if we eat, there are some things that are okay at room temperature, but a lot of things you think of, ice cream needs to be cold. It doesn't need to be lukewarm. Coffee needs to be hot. Doesn't need to be, a lot of lukewarm stuff is kind of gross. And you want to spew that out. So Jesus is given that image that God is not going to tolerate, kind of a half-hearted effort. So comes from this commandment. All right, let's go to the third commandment in verse 7. So this forbids all false oaths, taking a false oath that you're not going to keep, and also using God's name in profanity, in a profane way. Okay, skipping ahead a little bit, we see in Leviticus 19 and verse 12, and you shall not swear by my name falsely, neither shalt thou profane the name of thy God. I am the Lord. God is clear on this. We are not to take his name in vain. Now, what is that term vain? What does that mean? Yeah, useless. It's void. It's of no effect. You're wasting your time. Okay, and God talks about vain worshipers, right? You're wasting your time. So if we use God's name, it's empty, it's meaningless, it's void. We should have reverence for God's name, and so we're not to use it in that sense. Now, notice what Jesus said in Matthew 15 and verse 8. Because we can do this if we profess to honor God, but then we don't really honor God. We're professing Him in vain. Matthew 15:8, this people draweth nigh unto me with their mouth and honoreth me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Okay, so saying, I'm using God's name, but not in the proper way. So this would include, and this is one of the biggest ones you see today among a lot of, religious people. Obviously the heathens, they're going to cuss and, use horrible language, but this would also include using God's name flippantly, casually. Okay? So a big one today is OMG. And I think we all know what that means, right? And so people put that in their text messages, emojis, OMG, for insignificant things. Right? Oh, I left my shoes. OMG. Like, really? You got to use God's name for that? But it's just an everyday conversation. I heard this all the time when I was a school teacher. But it's just taking God's name in vain. It's not the proper way to use it. Or you've got these euphemisms, right? Golly, gosh. I mean, those are just substitutes for God's name, and that's taking His name in vain. So we need to stay completely away from these things. And our modern culture, does this kind of stuff all the time. And a lot of religious people probably do too, just don't think that much about it. But God is clear about this. It's like, when we speak the name of God, it needs to be in reverence. There needs to be a amount of fear and respect there, not just in casual conversation. So let's go to commandment number 4. And we know that when God created all things, of course, He took 6 days to do that, and He rested on the 7th, not because God was tired and He needed a nap, but it just simply means He didn't create anything new on day 7. Which, by the way, have you ever wondered why is a week for us? Why do we have a 7-day week? That's where it comes from. Right? But so God ceased His creation, and so this, keep the Sabbath holy, that's going to commemorate that. And there's no real evidence that the Israelites kept this while they were in Egypt. So this is now commanded at Sinai. Going forward, God expects them to keep the Sabbath holy. And so He said, whatever work that you need to do, that needs to be done the first 6 days of the week. But that last day of the week, you're not allowed to do any work on the Sabbath. Okay, and as we said, this is the only commandment that is not repeated in the New Testament. It's not part of the gospel of Christ. This specifically applied to the Jews only, and it died on the cross with Jesus. Because we saw again that Jesus fulfilled the law and Jesus ended the law because it had served its purpose, and God always intended for this to be a temporary, it's not a permanent thing. Okay, but as we said, the other 9 commandments, they are all restated in the New Testament because those things have always been true, all the things that you're going to see there. Then we have the 5th commandment. Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. So beginning with this commandment, again, now we've got man's relationship to man. So the first 4 were obligations to God. This is how we treat each other. So we see in Ephesians 6, 1 through 3, this is called the first commandment with promise, because you see there's a promise attached to it here in Exodus 20. Honor them, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord God giveth thee. So it includes the promise there. Okay, one way you can look at it, in a sense, Moses, of course, was the spokesperson for God. He was the mouthpiece of God to the Israelites. Well, the way God has designed it, the parents, at least they're supposed to be, the spokesman of God to their children. Okay, Proverbs 22:6 should be pretty familiar to us. Train up a child in the way he should go. When he is old, he will not depart from it. That's not a guarantee, but it means your children are much less likely to mess up if you teach them about God and you train them up in the law of God. So that is a responsibility that parents are given. Can we pass that off if we have children? Well, I don't really have to do that. Is that true? Yeah, this is a command again. So parents, mothers, fathers, they have a responsibility to teach their children spiritual truths. Okay? And we have seen already, I think, and we'll see in the future, God is, there's several places in Exodus and Leviticus where God is adamant about these remembrances they're going to have. He's teach your children. You have a responsibility to teach your children, your grandchildren, your descendants, so they will know these things because they didn't see them firsthand like you did. So you have an obligation to teach them. We as parents have an obligation to teach our children to respect God. Okay? And so God considered if a child went against his or her parents, that is rebellion against the parents, which in reality means what? If they are the spokesman for God, it's rebellion against God. That's the way God sees it. This is rebellion not just against your parents, but you are rebelling against authority given to them by God, which means you're rebelling against the authority of God. And so God obviously took that very, very seriously, so seriously that it included here in Leviticus 20:9, this is a death penalty offense for children to rebel against their parents. Now that's not continued in the New Testament, so you don't have a right to kill your kids, even though sometimes you'd like to, but can't do that anymore. But for them, that's how serious this was. It was a death penalty offense. Because again, it was seen as rebellion against God. Then in verse 13, we have the sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill. Okay? And you have a lot of discussion in our modern culture about this one. A lot of people misinterpret this. This will be people, they'll pull this up. They maybe know enough about the Bible to be dangerous, and they'll argue against the death penalty or things like that. Well, God says you can't kill. And that is what verse 13 says, thou shalt not kill. What does that mean? What God is forbidding here is murder. He is not forbidding all kinds of killing. Now, how do we know that? Yeah, there are other scriptures that would violate. How many times in the Old Testament did God command his people to go out and kill others? I mean, what are they going to do when they get to Canaan? They're going to conquer them. Well, the Canaanites aren't just going to go, oh, okay, y'all can have it. Right? They're going to have to kill them. And God told them to do it. Well, would God violate his own command? No. So it's not talking about all killing. It's specifically a command against murder. Okay? Now, we know this. Look at what Jesus said, Matthew 19:18. When Jesus is talking about the 10 Commandments, he saith unto him, which? Jesus said, thou shalt do no murder. How he phrased it. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness. So he's going through the list of commandments, and when he talks about this one, he says that specifically, thou shalt not murder. It's a word he uses. Okay? Because if you can't kill any at all, well, what about self-defense? If somebody broke into my house and they're going to kill me, or they're going to kill my wife, they're going to kill my son, do I not have a right to fight back and defend my family? Of course I do. God is not telling it, well, you just got to sit there and let them slit your throat. No, you don't. Self-defense is not murder. So that's authorized. You can do that. What about in war? Soldiers in war. Is that okay? Yeah, because God did it, right? There are a lot of, like I said, there's a lot of times He told them, I want you to go out. And we already saw where they fought the Amalekites. And what did God say He was going to do to them? I'm going to utterly destroy them, right? And He's going to use people to do that. God's not going to strike them dead with lightning. He's going to use it. Go out there. I want you to utterly destroy them. Kill all the people, kill all the animals. I want you to wipe them out. Well, that would violate this commandment if God was just saying you can't kill at all. So war is not covered under this commandment, but we do want to make this footnote. We're talking about, if God ordered them to, I want you to go and conquer this people, then is that a righteous command? Yeah, that's righteous. So the war needs to be righteous. That doesn't mean that God is condoning all kinds of war. What about Adolf Hitler? Think God was good with that? That was not a righteous war. Hitler didn't have to do all that stuff. He wasn't defending his nation or what. So it kind of depends on the context there, right? There can be an unrighteous war, which God would never condone. Hey, we just decided we'd beat up these people for no reason. We just thought we'd kill them for no reason. That's not going to be acceptable to God. Right? But soldiers are allowed to kill other soldiers on the battlefield if the cause is righteous. Okay, so the Nazis would not fall into that category because they were just murdering people. And that's what you can't do that. So that's what they were guilty of. But as we said, God ordered His servants on many occasions to kill people because that was God's justice against the wicked. Right? Hitler wasn't killing people because they were wicked. He was killing because he didn't like them and he wanted everybody to be a pure-blooded German. Well, that's not a good enough reason. That's not a righteous reason. Yes. Yes, and that's what God calls an abomination, right? Hands that rush to shed innocent blood. We cannot do that. That's what murder is. When you kill somebody that's innocent, they're not attacking you. They haven't done anything to you. They're not threatening your country, whatever. That's murder. You have no right to do that. Okay? And so that's what this commandment is. So it doesn't mean you can't ever kill for any reason. And God said all the way back into Genesis, God declared that murderers were to be executed. So again, this is a death penalty offense. But Sid mentioned it a while ago in Romans 13. What are we told there? What is authorized? Yeah, so the government has the right to execute criminals, for example. You better hope they're not innocent. So you get a little gray area there, right? But if somebody's been found guilty, they've committed a crime that is a death penalty offense, God has said the government is authorized to execute those people. God doesn't call that murder. Okay? So you put it a good way, right? Shedding innocent blood. That's what this commandment is forbidden. You can't just kill somebody just because you feel like killing them because the guy's dog dug up your azaleas or whatever. Not a good enough reason to kill somebody. Romans chapter 13. You read that chapter and it authorizes governments. And then one of the things it does in there is authorizes governments to execute people. So we're not supposed to do that as individual citizens, but the government has the authority to do that. And who created governments? God did in Romans 13. Yeah, he's saying governments are authorized because we need to have those. All right, then in verse 14, we got the seventh commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. Okay, so this occurs when either one or both of the parties are married, but not to each other. And we all know that this sin, it sure does cause a lot of destruction in its wake. It destroys families. It's a horrible thing. So under the law of Moses, this also carried a death penalty because that's how serious it was. Now, John 8:11, Jesus did away with that. They didn't kill people for it anymore, but was it still a sin? Oh, absolutely. And so if you don't repent of it, you're going to have death, all right. What kind of death? Spiritual death, right? But the physical death was taken away. But that's how serious it was for the Israelites. God said anybody caught doing this, they're to be killed. Because this was not supposed to happen at all. Okay, then the 8th commandment, thou shalt not steal. This is simply, of course, you're taking something that rightfully belongs to somebody else. You cannot do that. Okay, so we can steal from other people, and God forbids that. What about, is it possible for us to steal from God? Okay, if I'm making $200,000 a year and every week I put $5 in the collection plate, would we call that stealing from God? Yeah. Right? I'm making a whole lot I need to put more than $5 in. Right? There are some people that may be poverty stricken and they really can't put much in, but that's why Jesus said, as you've been prospered, right? But if I'm not giving the amount I should be giving, then I'm stealing from God. That's what I'm doing. I'm not giving him what I should. So we can steal from each other. We can steal from God. Those things are forbidden. You're not allowed to do that. All right, the 9th commandment. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. This is really a prohibition against lying. Okay, now this can be in court, but really it can be any time. We are supposed to tell the truth. If we are followers of God, we tell the truth. So this would include if you speak falsely about someone, or it would also include, what if you withhold the truth to hurt somebody? I know something that would clear somebody, but I'm just going to keep it to myself. Well, that's just as bad. We got to tell the truth. We got to make sure the right thing is done. What about telling a half-truth? Think God's okay with that? No. Well, I sort of kind of told the truth. I just left part of it out. Can't do that. We got to. You've seen all the TV shows they used to do. You go to court and do you promise to? Come on, say it with me. What is it? Yeah. So help you God, right? The whole truth, nothing but the truth. So help you God. Yeah. The whole truth. Well, could I just sort of give you half up? No. The whole truth, right? So there's no such thing, and you'll get religious people that, well, it's okay if you just tell a little white lie. Well, how little is little? It sure does. Revelation 21:8. I was just going there. You stole my thunder. That's all right. No, yeah. All liars will what? Where are they going? Yeah, they'll be cast into hell. All liars, not some of them, not the ones that tell the big whoppers, not just them. I don't remember reading anywhere in my Bible it says, thou shalt not lie, but it's okay to tell a little white lie, whatever that is. Right? I remember in Forrest Gump, y'all ever see Forrest Gump? He's the ping pong. I didn't really use that paddle, but Mama said, it's just a little white lie. I really didn't hurt anybody. Like, well, that's what your mama said, but you should have found out what God said. Right? But we humans, we tend to, well, that's not really a big lie. That's not, well, God doesn't distinguish. This lie is okay and that one's not. He said all liars. Right? And who's Satan? What's one of the descriptions for him? The father of all lies, right? Pretty sure he's in bad shape. So this one's pretty clear as well. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, because again, they think, well, it's just a little lie. It's not, it didn't kill anybody, But God doesn't He doesn't distinguish between what's a bad lie and what's a good lie. There's no such thing as a good lie. So, but you're right, that this is one that's broken considerably. And then the 10th commandment, verse 17. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that is thy neighbor's. That pretty much covers it all, right? Don't covet. So this deals with the desire in the heart, that you want something that doesn't belong to you. And when you have that desire in the heart, a lot of times, what does it lead to? It leads to the sin. It leads to the overt act, right? And so this is a lot of where stealing comes in, adultery comes in, murder comes in. A lot of times that's where all those things originate. You want something that's not yours. All right, then in verses 18 through 21, after he gets the commandments, and remember God had said nobody's allowed to touch the mountain, and Moses told him, and he went up, and God said, go down and tell him again. But really, Moses didn't need to worry about that, because it tells us here that the people were terrified. They didn't want to get anywhere near it. Because it says they were very afraid and they moved away. They didn't get closer to the mountain. They moved away from it. They were scared. Again, they heard God talking to Moses. They were scared of his voice. So they got a little taste there of God's awesome power. And then to close out this chapter, God gives some instructions, very specific instructions about what is acceptable worship. And so he talks about you can't have any gold or silver idols. He tells them he just wants a simple altar, nothing fancy. Where do they need to build the altar? Where they need to put it?
Holy place.
Yeah, and where's that? Yeah, well, once they get the tabernacle, they don't have it yet. But so basically, wherever God says, right? Wherever God declares is holy, that's where they need to put it. But he just wants a simple altar. It doesn't have to be fancy. He wants them to focus on him and on the sacrifice that they're offering. So God is, in these verses, he's very, very specific about what he wants. And so is there a lesson in there for us today? Same thing. God is very specific about what he wants. And should we follow that? Or is it okay for us to deviate from it? Do exactly what he says. He didn't say he wanted it, leave it out. He says he wanted it, and we better do it. It's not that hard. But yet people all the time, they want to deviate. And, well, we think this would be a good idea. Well, yeah, but God didn't think it was a good idea. So maybe we shouldn't do that. He's very specific, and he wants what he wants, and he asks for what he asks for. And this is clear in all these details that you see. And we're not going to go through all the details, but the main idea is God is very specific, he's very detailed, and he expects his will to be followed. You want to be a child of his. Okay? What you and I want is irrelevant. What God wants is the only thing that matters. So we notice that there are 4 different types of worship. I think that's one of the questions I asked you on your homework too. 4 different types of worship that the Bible talks about. So first of all, you have true worship. John 4:23-24, that's what God wants. It says God seeks true worshipers. Then we talked about this a few minutes ago, such a thing as vain worship. Matthew 15, where you are wasting your time because you're not doing what God says. But the world today will tell you that, well, as long as I'm worshiping God the way I see fit, but hey, I'm offering worship, God will accept it. That's what the world teaches. Was that true? We don't have to go very far in the Bible to find that out. Ask Cain. Did Cain worship God? He did. He offered worship to God. Was God okay with it? Absolutely not. Right? Whatever God had told Cain to do, he didn't do. He did something, but he took it upon himself. Well, I'm going to offer this. It'll be good enough. Well, obviously, if he'd done what Abel did the right thing. So we see already right there that all worship is not acceptable. But you have a lot of people today, well, as long as I'm worshiping, it didn't really matter what I do, because God knows I'm offering worship, so he'll be okay with it. Well, the Bible doesn't teach that. So that's vain worship. You're wasting your time. Then we have ignorant, what is called ignorant worship, which is similar. It's like, but some people, they do it on purpose because they're just stubborn. I'm going to do it my way. Other people, they do something wrong because they just don't know better. But that's why God's word is here. We better learn better and not worship God in ignorance. Well, I thought that was okay. Well, it's not. And then finally, you got what is called will worship. That's according to man's will. I don't care about God's will. I just want to do what I want to do. Okay? So true worship, vain worship, ignorant worship, will worship. These 4 types of worship that we see. And so what we're seeing in these verses here is God is very specific and he wants it done the way he wants it done. And he communicates that to Moses and he said, you go and you make sure everybody understands this. All right, chapter 21. Now, in these next few chapters, going through basically chapter 24, we're going to see a lot of different requirements of the law that God, again, told Moses, and Moses will relay it to the people. But one way you can kind of look at this, it's almost like some of this is like especially in this chapter, kind of like a Bill of Rights for people, again, about how we treat each other. And so God talks about how to behave toward various people in their camp, in their society. And he talks about women, how women are to be treated. He talks about how slaves are to be treated and how criminals are to be treated, those that are accused of a crime. So you could kind of call it like a Bill of Rights. You know, everybody needs to be treated with a certain dignity in a certain way. And so we want to talk a little bit for a minute about the slaves, because you know you'll hear people say, "Well, see, God condoned slavery. He approved of slavery. He wanted there to be slaves." Well, he never said that. But slavery existed. It was all over the world by this point. But there's a little bit of a difference between slaves in the Hebrew society as opposed to the rest of the world. And we know this in the historical record. So you don't just have to go to the Bible. You can even go to the secular record and find this out. Their system of slavery was not like the Egyptians or everybody else's. Okay? And so typically, and again, here God has rules. If you're going to have slaves, you got to treat them a certain way. What about in other societies? Do you have to be nice to your slaves? No, who cares? But God said, well, if you're going to have one, you better treat them a certain way. You can't just do whatever you want. So he established that if you do have somebody that is a slave, we'll talk about the reasons in a second, they can only do that for 6 years. Can't be enslaved for the next 50 years. Like in most other societies, you were a slave for life. So only 6 years, and then you have to set them free. You have to. Why is that? Well, because it comes down to why they were slaves, which was not true in most other societies. Why were they slaves here? Well, usually Hebrew people became a slave because they were sold into slavery, into bondage, because they owed a debt that they couldn't pay. So, okay, well, you're going to be my slave for a while. In other words, you're going to work off because you don't have the money. You owe me $100. You don't have $100. You don't have $1. So you got to work for me for free for a while until you get that paid off. That was typically why somebody became a slave. It could be due to theft, so it was a punishment. You steal from somebody, that person had a right to make you their slave, to make up for what you stole. So it was a punishment for crime. So it wasn't allowed to just, well, I don't like that person, or that person has a different skin color than me, or what. That kind of stuff wasn't allowed. Now, parents, and they'll make a big deal out of this too, parents were allowed to sell their children into slavery. And when I say it like that, we all kind of get, what? That's awful. But again, that's kind of the language that was used, but what did it mean? Well, what it meant when they say God had rules about that, or if you're going to sell your child, you got to do this, that, and the other. What that meant was, it was like an apprenticeship. Okay, so if I have a kid and I'm going to sell him to Bob because Bob is a skilled craftsman, he has a trade that I want my son to learn. So what it meant for me to sell him to you would mean he's your apprentice. He's going to work for you for free, but is my kid going to get something out of it? Yeah, Bob's going to train him in that skill so that when my kid gets a little older, and again, because he can't be a slave forever, for a few years, but he's going to learn. But at the same time, Bob has to feed him, clothe him, house him, and teach him this trade, which I don't know how to do. Right? So I'm going to send my kid to him, but that's what they called selling him into slavery. But it's really like, I want you to teach him a skill. That way, when he finishes his apprenticeship, he can go out and he can do whatever job that Bob's doing. That makes sense? Okay. So that's what they were talking about here, is to learn a skill. So these people were more like servants than the harsh system of slavery that you saw pretty much everywhere else. It was a little different here. And so we'll see when we get to Leviticus, they were instructed, God commanded them, you will not deal harshly with your slaves, your servants, those that are working for you. You will not deal harshly with them. You will treat them with kindness and respect. They're simply working for you to pay off their debt or whatever it is. So you don't need to treat them like they're beneath you. You're using them for work. Now, to show you that this wasn't, I don't really think it'd be my cup of tea. They'd want to do that. But you look at the records again, they had the option. If they were a slave, they could choose to be a slave for life, but it was their choice. Nobody could make them after the 6 years was up. But some of them felt like their conditions were so good, they chose to remain in that condition, which is kind of interesting. But again, the historical record shows that as well. So they could be free after 6 years, or they could voluntarily say, you know what, I'll continue in this relationship. It's been beneficial for me. I don't want to get out on my own. I'll just stay here. So they could do that. And part of that probably was because God demanded they be treated a certain way. They couldn't be treated harshly. Then verses 12 through 17, it talks about capital cases. Like we've already said, murderers were to be executed. If somebody was guilty of murder, they were to be put to death. If the killing was an accident, sometimes, accidents do happen. The killer was allowed to flee by God, was allowed to go to a place of refuge. And in fact, later when they get to Canaan, God is going to create 6 cities of refuge where you could go there and stay there and nobody could touch you. And that gave the family time to calm down, because you accidentally killed one of their family members. And so now they want to kill you, but it was an accident. So God said, you can go to this place of refuge where you cannot be, they can't come get you, they can't take you, and it'll give them time to cool off and realize you didn't mean to do it. It really was an accident. It's not something you deserve to die for. Okay? This is where you also see where God said rebelling against the parents and kidnapping. If you kidnap somebody, that was a death penalty offense too. So he just talks about capital cases where death is the penalty. Then verses 18 through 17, it really, just to sum up, it talks about cases involving injuries. If you fight with somebody and you hurt the other guy, well, what happens? If you hurt one of their animals, things like that. And the bottom line is basically you had to make restitution, you had to make good. If I hurt somebody, broke his arm, and he missed work for 6 weeks, I got to pay him that salary that he missed that he would have been at work, something like that. You've got to make restitution for the damage that you've caused. Okay, and this also talks about masters will be punished if they kill their slaves. That was considered to be murder. Where in most other societies, what were slaves considered to be? Just property, like this table. They weren't people. It's just a piece of, you can't kill a coffee table. Well, here they could, right? You weren't allowed to kill your slave. That was considered to be murder because a slave was a person just like anybody else. There were rules like if you injured a pregnant woman and if the baby died, then certain restitution had to be made. If the baby didn't die, then a different restitution had to be made. But again, the bottom line is just if you cause damage to somebody else, you've got to make up for it. You've got to pay for it. And going back to the slaves again, like if the master beat his slave and injured him, he was required to give the slave freedom that day. Like he couldn't, well, you got 3 years left on your contract. Well, it doesn't matter. You just beat him up, so he's free today. You have to let him go. So there were ways you were supposed to treat people. And then 28 through 36, along the same lines, but this was injuries caused by animals. Right, so if I have an ox and he killed somebody, something like that, my animal is responsible for killing or damaging something. This talks about the restitution that would have to be paid for that. Okay.
Injury by an animal or?
Yeah, caused by an animal. So the verses before this is caused by people. But so if I hurt you, then I got to make restitution. But if I have an ox and he hurts you, I've got to make restitution for that too. Unless my ox has been known to be aggressive and I didn't do anything about it, then it's my fault. Okay? It's kind of like today, if you have a rabid dog and the dog bites somebody, who's in trouble? Well, the owner is going to be in trouble, right? Because you didn't take the proper steps. You knew that animal is dangerous. So same thing here. But if it wasn't that case and my animal caused damage to you, then I would have to make restitution for whatever had happened. Okay? And it is interesting that it says if a servant was killed by an ox, something, then the owner of the ox had to pay 30 shekels of silver. Now that sounds familiar. Yeah, that's what Judas was paid to betray Jesus, was 30 shekels of silver. Let's see real quick. Give me a couple minutes. Let's see if we can at least finish chapter 22 and go through it pretty quick. So 22 verses 1 through 15, this is laws dealing with theft and property. And again, the same idea. Restitution has to be made. If you steal something, or if the loss was caused by your animal, loss from fire, I borrowed something for you and I tore it up, those kind of things. It tells you in these verses, here's what you've got to do in each case. If this happens, then you do this. If this happens, you do. We're not going to go into all those details, but the idea was you have to make it right. If you're responsible for hurting somebody else, you need to make it right. Okay, then verses 16 through 31, this deals with moral issues. Okay, a code of conduct. So one example would be, says if a man seduced a woman, he was required to marry her. And he also had to pay a dowry of 50 shekels. You see that? Talks about the dowry in Deuteronomy. So he's got to marry her, and he was never allowed to divorce her for any reason. So pretty significant penalty for doing that. And if the father refused the marriage, you still had to pay the dowry. Maybe the dad I don't want my daughter to marry you, but you'd still have to pay the dowry. But if the father was okay with it, then you were required to marry her, and you were stuck with her from then on. Okay, this is where you see mention of things like bestiality, witchcraft, idolatry, all punishable by death. Talked about how to treat foreigners. Basically, you can't mistreat them. Remember, you all were foreigners in Egypt. Remember how you were treated, so you can't mistreat foreigners just because they're not Hebrew. And it's also here where you see that if you loan money to someone, what could you not do? Yeah, no usury. U-S-U-R-Y. I should have put that up there, but that's interest. You can't charge interest. So if I loan you $100, you pay me back $100. I can't charge interest, so you have to pay me more than that. Okay, they could take collateral, but you could not charge interest. And so again, the idea is they had to respect God by respecting each other, how they're treating each other. Okay, so I was hoping we'd get further, but I guess we probably need to stop there. We're already over for a few minutes. So anyway, so next week we'll do 23 and 24, and then that's where your test, it will cover up through chapter 24. So we'll definitely, should be, Lord willing, finish that up next week.